Hey everyone, welcome to the Journey Home podcast. And today I am continuing in my series, Advice to My Younger Self. And the advice I want to share today, this is part 6 in our series. And the advice I want to share today is this: to obey is better than sacrifice. To obey is better than sacrifice. And if that sounds familiar, it comes directly from the Bible. It's something that the prophet Samuel says to King Saul. And this story is recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 15. So in this story, the Lord speaks to Saul through the prophet Samuel, and he commands him to basically execute his judgment upon this people group called the Amalekites. And, it gets pretty dark here, but the instructions are to basically to destroy the entire people. Don't spare anyone, man, woman, even infants, and even the animals. God is clear that Saul is not to spare anyone. And so, Saul goes ahead and he executes this command ish, right? He doesn't 100% obey it, and he leaves the king of the Amalekites alive. He leaves what the Bible says, the best of the some of the animals alive, and then they do destroy everything else. And so, in his mind, he's obeying God's word, but as we'll see in a minute, in the Lord's view, Saul did not obey what the Lord had commanded him to do. And we don't know exactly the reason, but at least in my translation, I think it hints at it a little bit. I think that they were happy to destroy the things that they perceived as not having a lot of value or, undesirable. But, the king they wanted to spare. Some say that, in those times, in these wars between nations, they would leave the other king alive as kind of like a trophy, of their victory, right? And it was part of the Hebrew worship that, again, the Lord commanded that they sacrifice the best of the animals. And so, possibly in Saul's mind, he's thinking, I know the Lord told me to destroy everything, even all the animals, but, he also is pleased, when we sacrifice, the best of our flocks to him, as an act of worship. And so maybe in his mind, he's thinking, I know the Lord said that, but he couldn't possibly have meant that. And so, maybe he's saving these animals to worship. So again, I'm not even accusing Saul of all these evil intentions. I think in his mind, he has a good reason, for the decisions that he made. But then, as the story continues, Samuel shows up, and the Bible tells us that Saul comes up to Samuel, and he says, "I have carried out the Lord's instructions," right? This is verse 13. He greets Samuel and he says, "May the Lord bless you. I have carried out the Lord's instructions." So I don't know if I guess there's a couple of possibilities. One is he genuinely believes that he has obeyed the Lord, even though he hasn't fully, right? Maybe 90%, 95% even, but he hasn't fully obeyed what the Lord commanded him to do. So maybe he genuinely has, convinced himself, or he knows that he hasn't fully obeyed, but maybe he's just thinking, oh, but, the Lord's going to understand, right? I don't, and, the Bible doesn't tell us exactly what his thinking is in that moment, but it's clear that, he has not fully obeyed, but, when he, at least in his words to Samuel, he believes he's obeyed the Lord's instructions. But then Samuel confronts him, obviously, and he says, then what's with all these animals that are here? That wasn't the command. And Saul offers his explanation, but the bottom line, is this. And Samuel just stops him in his tracks, and he says, basically that he has not obeyed the Lord. And because of that, he is now, the Lord has basically rejected Saul now as the king of Israel. and he's going to give his kingdom to another, you know. Um, and this is where Samuel, brings that phrase that I started with. In verse 22, it says, Then Samuel said, Does the Lord take pleasure in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? Look, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to pay attention is better than the fat of rams. So what he is saying to Saul is that what the Lord is looking for, it's not sacrifice, it's obedience, right? So even though Saul can kind of try to justify it in his mind that, oh, but I save these so that I can sacrifice them to the Lord, which again, in most circumstances was an appropriate response. But in this particular situation, that was not what the Lord had asked him or commanded him, I would say, to do. And so even though it would have been, a sacrifice and a sacrificial act, it was not pleasing to the Lord in this instance because it wasn't obedience to what he had commanded Saul to do. And so to be sure, as we live our lives and as we seek to obey God, like that is going to involve a level of sacrifice, a measure of sacrifice, right? Our walk with God, our obedience to God, will be costly at times, and some of us, at some point may be called upon to make the ultimate sacrifice, which is to lay our lives down for the sake of the gospel, to be martyrs for the gospel. That is something that, has happened throughout history, and I believe it's continuing to happen today all over the globe. People are literally laying their lives down because they are followers of Christ, and and I think more will be asked to make that sacrifice before the end comes, before the end of this age, but just because, it's true that obeying God will involve a level of sacrifice, that doesn't mean that every sacrifice is of God or is equals obedience to God, right? I can sacrifice, I can just, come up with some random act that is super sacrificial. But if God hasn't commanded me to do that, if God hasn't asked me to do that, then that's not obedience, right? And it may actually not be pleasing to the Lord. I think we have to be careful because what can happen is we can develop this kind of like a subconscious theological assumption, right? That obedience equals whatever requires the most sacrifice, or whatever's the hardest thing, or whatever's the most difficult thing. Surely that is the will of God for my life, right? And I've totally met people like that. I'm sure you have too, where it's like they just assume that whatever the will of God is for their life, it has to be the hardest path or the most costly path or the most sacrificial path. Now, again, there will be times when that's true, but it's not automatically the same thing, if that makes sense, right? I think, at times the reverse can also be true too. Sometimes there can be this theology of ease, right? Or that God's will is always going to be easy. And I think that's also a mistake. I think that's also just false. Honestly, it's just not true. Now, I'm not saying the will of God is never easy. There might be sometimes when it is, or relatively easy, right? But that doesn't mean that's not the same as saying unless it's easy, it's not God, right? Hopefully that makes sense, right? And so we have to be careful on either side. We can kind of make these assumptions, but that's not true. When I look back at my journey, for sure, there were times where obedience to the Lord, it was costly, but that's not the same thing as us just choosing some random sacrificial action and just saying, let's do that because surely that must be the will of God, right? Like many of you know, me and my family lived overseas at a time and in the Middle East, and we went during a time where there was a lot of terrorist activity. Our safety was by no means guaranteed. And I'm not saying that to be dramatic. Like the streets that we lived on, that we walked on frequently, some of those very streets were places where, bombs went off, and fortunately we weren't there at those times, but we easily could have been, and so I don't think I'm being dramatic to say that, our safety was not guaranteed, and so that was costly to us, there was a lot that we had to surrender to the Lord and walk through, and at the same time it was just an amazing time too. So I don't want you to feel sorry for us, honestly. I wouldn't trade it for anything. Um, but for sure it was costly, and but again, we were happy to to offer that as a sacrifice to the Lord, because we knew that was what He was asking us to do. Again, it wasn't just some random, let's just choose the hardest thing we can think of to do and let's go do that, right? It was, because we wanted to obey what God had asked us to do in a given season. We surrendered to it, and we embraced the costliness of it, the sacrifice of it. Um, so there have been times like that in my life, but I will say there have been other times where obedience to the Lord, probably didn't look as costly to an outside observer, right? Maybe it may have looked even easy. Doesn't mean it was easy, but I'm just saying it didn't appear uh, blatantly or overtly costly, right? Even right now, me and our family, we're kind of in a season where, we're continuing to do ministry, but it's very scaled back. And it's because I think we really feel like that's what the Lord has given us in this season of our lives. Um, and, again, it doesn't mean we're doing nothing, but it's very, very scaled down. It's very slow paced. And I think it's right for this season, and I think it is what the Lord has asked of us and called us to do in this season, and we're doing it out of obedience to Him. And in some sense, it has been easy in the sense that it's not been super busy, um, but that doesn't mean it's not costly, right? Actually, it initially went against some of our instincts, because some of our initial responses were like, no, 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 we gotta plow right now, we gotta build. And just time and time again we felt the Lord just bringing us back to, no, no, this is a season to draw back a little bit, to kind of re-envision, to kind of refresh, to heal, and other things, to learn, to study, like. And so, as try as hard as we might to just plow, eventually we began to recognize what the Lord was asking of us and began to agree with it, and partner with it and surrender to it. And so in that sense, it's been an easier season, but costly at the same time, if that makes sense. Um, and so my point in all this is that the point is that we obey God, right? And that's Samuel's point to Saul. The point is not whether it's easy or hard, right? Or costly or not costly. The point is, are we obeying God? Whether it seems easy, quote unquote easy, or whether it seems difficult, are we obeying God in this season and in every season? Um, so again, this is, advice to my younger self, because this is something that I learned at a young age. I don't know if I fully really understood it, um, but it was helpful to me in just making decisions in my life, because again, I didn't assume that the hardest path was always the right path, and I didn't assume that the easiest path was always the right path. It really came down to, what is God asking of me in this season, and am I obeying it? And if I'm doing that, then that's enough, and sometimes you might feel the burden of expectation from yourself or from others to be doing more or to be, whatever, suffering more. I don't know. Who knows what kind of expectations, you're putting on yourself or people are putting on you. But at the end of the day, I just want to encourage you again, that's not what matters. It's, are you obeying what the Lord's asked of you? And are you following his voice? And if you are, then I hope that um, helps you to resist all the other kinds of opinions and pressures that others would put on you. And then, the reverse is also true. Like for us, why do we need to have so many opinions about what other people are doing with their lives? Because how do we know what the Lord has asked of them in a given season, right? And so, we might think that someone is doing too much or not enough or whatever, but at the end of the day, unless we know for sure what God has asked that person, how can we say whether they're being obedient or not, right? And so anyway, just lots of different thoughts around this principle. But again, at the end of the day, I want to leave you with this: to obey is better than sacrifice. And so my prayer for you is that you would, by the grace of God, to the best of your ability, be faithful to what he's given you. Be faithful to what he's asked of you in this season and in every season, and really not to do anything more or anything less than that. And hopefully that is enough for you, because you find comfort, you find security in knowing that you're walking in the will of God for your life. And so I hope that helps you. Hope it blesses you. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.